Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching Big Picture with Rausan Pereira. The central government has been batting for and trying to push through privatization in a big way. The Prime Minister himself has said time and again his government will push ahead with plans to monetize and modernize the assets of the country. The government firmly believes public sector enterprises which do not occupy a position of strategic importance should not be kept functional. The only responsibility of the government is to support the country's enterprises and businesses. The government does not want to be in the business of doing business. Meanwhile, the opposition has slammed the central government for its policies on privatization. In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze how much privatization do we need. Joining me on the program today are Ajay, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India; Jayandas Gupta, former Ambassador of India at the WTO; and Prawal Singh, Vice President, Marketing, Zoho Corporation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Mr. Dua, let me start the program with you first. Of late we've seen that the central government has been talking about privatization, and it's been a good year and a half now since several sectors have been opened up to the private industry. So how much of privatization is good? How much of privatization do we need? Your thoughts?
Privatization per se has clear advantages, but these advantages are not all pervasive. Let's remember that. The market can distort matters, markets can distort resource allocations, markets can bring about efficiencies and hurt people at the margin. So privatization has to be seen in a context. The Indian context, where we have a large population, fair amount of people still living at the margin, roughly 15% of 1.4 billion gets you about 200 million people, and fair amount of them are in agriculture, which is probably far away from privatization. So I'm talking on generalities right now to answer your question. Yes, so-called Thatcherism is good, but we have to go about it in a calculated, careful manner and not immediately get carried away by privatization in every segment of the economy, every sector of the economy, but do that consciously and do that consistently, but over time.
All right, since we are here then, Ambassador, let's talk about the issue of, privatization in farming or in agriculture. That has been a heated issue in the recent past. Farmers have been agitating as well, and precisely for this particular reason. So, can we see the kind of privatization that we need to see in agriculture? What is the model that best suits us?
I think this concept of privatization is generally spoken of in relation to the public sector undertakings where the government has a share or it owns these public sector undertakings. In the case of agriculture, it is privatized. It is in the hands of private individuals. The issues there are different about bringing in contract farming, about allowing larger entities to come up, like the farmer producers organizations, for instance, which is in a sense giving up the autonomy of an individual farmer and becoming a part of a larger entity. But privatization, to my mind, is when the government owns the assets and it wants to dilute its share or to give it up completely or to make a strategic kind of a divestment. So I would look at privatization in this context only.
All right. So, Prawal, let me bring you in now. As far as privatization is concerned, let's talk about the private sector. Let's talk about what they can bring to the table. How can they enhance the existing ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. I mean, on this topic, what we believe, and being part of a private company, one thing that privatization can improve is the kind of service that we can provide to the end customer or consumer, and the overall experience of buying, purchasing a service or a product. Now, that is something that is essentially a strong reason why privatization works well. And I mean, alongside, it also increases the accountability. And there's so many examples, be it the telecom sector or, some of the manufacturing sectors we have seen. One thing though, privatization will work well when we make sure that it is competitive, the environment, the industry, and monopolies are prevented. Now, that's a key factor there when you bring in privatization. Also, what we believe is, government will have to focus on policy level regulations, and ensure that while this happens, the interest of the weakest sections of society, that remains protected. That's very important, and the development doesn't happen at the cost of the constitutional rights. So that's something to be, concerned of. But largely speaking, the private sector has the responsibility, I believe, to tap the talent, because as a country with 1.3 billion people, we have a lot of untapped talent, potential, opportunity. So, which we have seen, at least in some sectors. I mean, let's leave the seven Maharatnas aside, the areas that they play in. But for the most part, be it software, be it IT, high tech, some of the manufacturing of commodities that we use, could be medical equipment or batteries, for example, right? Some of these areas can do so much better and so much more when privatization is brought in with policy level regulations from the government. From an execution standpoint, I think that's something that, at least in some sectors, would be a good step.
Absolutely. Mr. Dua, let's talk about this aspect of tapping talent now. And I want to bring it in and, merge it with something else that has been happening. Rajasthan, Haryana, I beg your pardon, recently brought in a law which stated that, they have to have 75% reservation. Jharkhand seems to be going down that way as well. So when you're looking at tapping talent and when you have state governments bringing in laws like this, how is it going to help? And what is the private sector then going to do?
You're absolutely right, Frank. If every state were to have its such laws, we will be fragmenting the country. We would be giving away a whole lot of advantages of a large, of a united, uniform, united country. All those kind of things are certainly not desirable. But having said that, let me just get back to the issues which were raised about, is it a good time to privatize, how much we should privatize, and then revisit it at an appropriate time, this issue of talent. I think, Frank, while there are clear advantages of privatization, and when I say privatization, I'm talking the language which I have used, privatizing the assets which are today in government's control, owned by the government, controlled by the government, giving away those to the private sector to run, particularly in the consumer goods, consumer goods sector, particularly in services. These are not the kind of fortes of the government. Government, we thought about the public sector or putting it at the commanding heights of the economies in the mid 50s, only in the capital intensive sectors, because there was a shortage of capital at that point of time. There was also probably at that point of time much more acute shortage of technology and people. So the government came in to start the process of industrialization in the country. But since then, we have moved a long way, 60 odd years since then. So, right now, the government's emphasis has to be clearly that it cannot do the things which are better left to private ownership, private management, and private capital. Enough private capital is coming in there. That's the number one principle I would like to be guided by. Second, let's not do, when I said let's not do everything at the same time, because that we do not have a very deep capital market in the country, or the money would come rushing in from all over the world to pick up the assets of Indian public sector companies. That's not going to happen. You've seen it in the case of Air India. It may not be a typical case, but it did have a whole lot of flying rights. It did have a fleet. It did have talent also, so to say, maybe over talent, too many of them around. But the fact is that the up to a point only there is capital available to buy the government's assets. So government can draw up a pipeline, which it is doing. 8 ministries have sent their projects which can, or projects or assets which can be privatized. All very good. But the government, along with the people who understand the capital market, people who understand the overall macro scheme, take a macro view, they prioritize. I have to get rid of these two banks. Good enough. How much money would I be sucking away from the capital market? After all, from the same capital market, the government banks are going to be drawing, private sector banks are going to be drawing, and now we are also talking about corporates also going to be tapping the same market. So that is the point when I say yes, desirable privatization in a number of sectors, not everywhere, not certainly even where it is desirable. Let us have a roadmap clear, given to our appetite for privatization. When I say appetite, tell me if the private sector, if the organized sector in the country only creates 10 to 12% of the total jobs, and that itself is not too much. Now, even if those organized 10 to 12% jobs become uncertain in the hands of the private sector, if you put restrictions, you can't sack people, then what are you privatizing? You're not letting the private sector efficiencies come in. So jobs are going to be more uncertain. You are talking of a time when when the world and the country is still going through the pandemic. So there is a timing issue as well for it. You have to keep all these things in mind when we talk about, getting the benefits of private sector, including talent, etc. All that's recognized, but it has to be gradual. It has to be tempered program.
Absolutely. And Mr. Dasgupta, let me take that particular aspect forward with you. Desired but not everywhere as far as privatization is concerned. So let's talk about the strategic sectors, strategic assets. What's likely to happen there? How much can the private sector contribute? How much of it should be opened up to the private sector?
As far as the strategic sectors are concerned, atomic energy, defense, the mineral sector, petroleum and natural gas, telecom, roads, railways, these are some of the strategic sectors. Now, there are issues about privatization and there are issues about asset monetization. Without parting with the ownership of an asset, for instance, if there is a road which has been constructed from government funds and it is given to a private operator to collect toll from and to operate and maintain. So tolling, operations, and then transfer back to the government. That is not exactly privatization. It is an asset monetization. You are giving the rights to make the asset profitable, and you are giving it to a private entity because it is much more efficient. So that is something which I think the government is thinking of doing for the telecom sector as well, for oil and gas pipelines, for 150 railway stations I was reading some in the paper, and other railway assets. Now, I'm not sure that these assets are going to be transferred as far as the ownership is concerned, but they are going to be utilized by the private sector, and about 150 trains will also be introduced. The rolling stock may be that of the government,
but the maintenance and the operations will be contributed the maintenance will be contributed to by the private operator, and the operations will be conducted by them in collaboration with the railway. So that is one aspect of this whole thing. The second aspect is about strategic assets. I think the government has made it very clear that in the strategic sector, not more than 4 private sector undertakings will be allowed to continue. And as of 2019, there were 348 central public sector undertakings. And I'm not talking of the departmental undertakings like the railways and the defense establishments which make armaments and other things. So of these, you have to separate which of them are non-essential, which of them have outlived their utility. You know, in 1956, when we had the industrial policy, we reserved 17 sectors for the public sector. Because as Dr. Dua has pointed out, capital was scarce, the government had to come in and spend. And we, in addition, 12 of them, sectors, we said will be progressively, we will increase the public sector presence. Now, the situation has changed. So out of the 348 public sector undertakings, suppose and the government, I think, has drawn up a list of 100 of those, which are not considered strategic, which can be divested, and possibly yield about 250,000 crores. So that is the kind of assessment unit by unit which we need to do. And then if we feel that there are certain PSUs which can continue, but the assets that they're holding, not all of them need to be retained by the PSU. For efficient functioning, for monetizing those assets, we can part with the assets, some of the assets. And finally, we come to the issue of the banks, other financial institutions like the LIC. The government has already made it clear that the LIC shares will be divested. 2 of the private banks will be privatized. 1 insurance company will be privatized. Presumably, it will be a general insurance company. So that, I think, will free up assets which are no longer required to be tied down. And they can be utilized by the government for social sector spending, for instance, in health, education, water supply, pollution control, etc.
Right. All right. So, Praval, since we're here, let me take this particular aspect forward with you. What is it that the private companies are going to look for? Like Mr. Dasgupta has just suggested, we're looking at divestment, we're looking at, assets as well. So, when the private companies look at investing in PSUs and investing in strategic assets, what is it that they look at? What is it that they want to focus on?
Frank, like I said, in the interest of private companies from this policy standpoint is being able to function in certain ways where the focus is on, not just profitability, but efficiency. And efficiency in the sense of how do we create more jobs in the country? How do we tap, like I said, the talent in the country? How do we create goods and services which otherwise were a lot harder? So from a policy standpoint, so government still needs to be involved, like I said, in creation of the policies and ensuring that the weaker sects of the society, are not taken for a ride by this move. But at the same time, the opportunity for the private companies, lies in, in newer areas where the investments can happen with a policy that is favoring private companies and ensuring that there is some sense of balance that exists. I think there's a lot that private companies can come forward to, and we have seen that happen in the last 10 years to an extent. What I would also like to say is, private sector, it's not just about waiting for the government to do things for us. Private sector now, I think, can step in proactively and have this purpose of serving the local community, and creating solutions to problems that exist, because there is clear demand both within India and outside India that we as a country can produce. And we've seen that happen in other parts of the country, China, Germany, these are some of the good examples that exist. We can do that as well. And for that, the private sector has to come forward, grab the opportunity and focus on essentially building the capabilities and the know-how. And I've said this previously as well, that for the last several decades, India has had a focus of the trader mindset, right? And we have to move to the maker mindset. And I think this is the opportunity for the private sector to grab that opportunity and move forward as a maker with a maker mindset. And I think that's what the government is looking at as well with this move.
All that you said is all great, and we wish that happens. But then when you look at the private companies as a whole, Prawal, there's a general notion that the private companies are in the market only to make money, and very few of them act responsibly. So isn't the onus now on the private sector as well to try and get the faith of the people too going forward?
And you're right. And you know what, Frank? I think beyond the scope of CSR, which is a mandate, companies that go forward and take a step towards the larger good of the society, the community, and they often get recognized. I mean, this is something that we have seen happen. And with this, in the modern age of media, entertainment, and technology all blending together, and us being able to do these conversations on internet the way we are today, a lot has changed in the last 10 years, and the penetration of the broadband and people having access to data and internet, it's all out there. It's a lot easier today for a private company to do something if they really believe in it, and for the world to see. They don't have to depend on a particular medium or a media or any of the larger publishers to sort of share what they're doing. So all this actually is bringing forward companies who have the potential to do something. Not every private company can think of uplifting the society, when they are still figuring out how their finances and business would work. But the ones that are capable of doing it, and there are several in India that are doing that, it's an opportunity for them to come forward, tap into the talent, create the local know-how and the capability to make stuff, produce stuff, and this is not something we can think of would happen in a couple of years and the country would change. But this mindset, if it starts to change over the course of next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll see a massive impact of this move.
Absolutely, we need to do something now to see an impact 10 or 15 years down the road. All right, time to get closing comments now from all my panelists with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Mr. Dua.
Frank, I think while we have to make things easier for the private sector to operate, with so-called ease of doing business, etc., all those things have to be attended to. We have to also make sure that the private sector continues to have, in the name of level playing field, what we aim at. Sometimes we go overboard, sometimes we make things not really level playing for them. So I would emphasize the role of independent regulators as extremely important for the private sector before the private sector's role is enhanced. Second, I would say most of the GDP of the country, let's accept it, other than defense and business, gets created in the states, not sitting in New Delhi or in any of the bhavans. So the action of regulatory mechanisms and supportive to private sector role in identified sectors, a consensus has to be built by the central government with the states as well, because the things may not be falling actually in the state government's domain as per the constitutional scheme of things. But because the action is in the state governments, the states have to be taken on board before we launch on a very major effort to privatize or even monetize assets which affect the private sector, which affect the common sector. See, you've seen we want to in Andhra we wanted to sell off a steel mill, RIML. Protest there. The state government has gone to it's a steel. RIML is a subsidiary of SAIL. SAIL wanted to sell it. Central government is the owner of it. State government has stepped in saying you can't do this. And because they have to necessarily look at the interest there. So it's not just because it affects 5,000 jobs there, it affects the jobs of the miners, etc., the downstream as well as upstream, a whole lot of jobs. So getting a consensus is extremely important and putting regulations in place to make sure that while it is a level playing field, it also takes care of all the stakeholders, including consumer interests within that.
All right, Mr. Dasgupta.
Just two quick points. One is that the CAG's report of 2017-18 says that since 1991, public sector divestment has enabled raising of 5 lakh crores of rupees. And mind you, a lot of that is on, in the 90s and late 90s, early 2000s. So the present value would be much more. So it is a target, the target of divesting in 100 companies and raising 250,000 is a very reasonable target. The second point is that it is not going to be a bed of roses. There are issues because it will be handled by, one of the things which the government did between 1999 and 2004 was to set up a separate ministry, set up a separate cabinet committee for dealing with divestment. Now, that is the kind of approach, a bold approach, which needs to be done. And the people who would be involved in divesting must be given the assurance that they would not be hounded, for whatever reason, political reason or otherwise, if they have done a bona fide job. And this normally happens later. So this sense of security has to be instilled in the people who handle the divestment.
All right, and Prawal Singh, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So, like I said, Frank, I think for the government, in areas where there is already a competitive market, take pharmaceuticals and steel and some of that, and markets where there are a few dominant players but is regulated, for example, telecom, right? I think it makes sense for the government to come up with a provision to get private players to take place. But of course, to do that, government has to ensure that there is a framework in place where there's a service framework, there is a regulation involved, there is subsidy for essentially, like I said, the weaker sections of society. And the whole process, how it can be transparent, how we can have competitive bidding, things like that have to be kept in mind while we do that. And from a private sector perspective, right, as entrepreneurs, I would say the entrepreneurs who are in a position to do that, to create jobs essentially in the country, they should come forward. They would have to come forward and take a proactive measure towards serving the local community by creating jobs, investing in creating the know-how, the capability for the country to become a maker country from a trader country. That mindset, and like I said, this with the mindset of this in the next couple of years is what I think would be the larger good for the nation. And that's how the government and the private sectors have to play with each other together.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that privatization is desired and can bring about necessary results. However, it may not be appropriate to go for large-scale privatization. We need to have a clear roadmap and policies so that the right ecosystem is created. The private sector, too, needs to be more proactive rather than wait for the government to always take the lead. Every opportunity needs to be seized. With that, it's a wrap. This is Frank Rausan Pereira signing off. But before I leave, let me remind you to like and subscribe to Bharata First on YouTube and follow Bharata First on social media. Please spread the word.